The Valkyrie homeworld hung in the void, surrounded by the largest human fleet ever assembled, and the once proud capital of a galactic empire now waited in terrified silence for the judgment of the species it had wronged. Admiral Una Park stood on the observation deck of the Indomitable and gazed at the blue-green world below, where billions of Valkyrie civilians huddled in their homes and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Minister Di Yung Cho stood beside her and looked thin and pale from his months of imprisonment, but his eyes remained clear and his spirit remained unbroken. "They treated you badly," Park said without looking away from the planet. "They treated me as they treat all beings they consider inferior," Cho replied. "But I survived, and I am here, and that is what matters. The Council wants me to burn their world." Cho nodded slowly. "I know, and many would say they deserve it after what they did. Do you think they deserve it?" The old diplomat considered the question and remembered his time in the Valkyrie prison and the guards who had mocked him, and the interrogators who had tried to break him, and the officials who had sneered at his pleas for basic dignity. He also remembered the young Valkyrie physician who had secretly treated his injuries, and the kitchen worker who had slipped him extra food when no one was watching, and the janitor who had whispered words of encouragement through his cell door. "There are monsters among them," Cho said finally, "but there are also ordinary people who simply want to live their lives and raise their children, and those people do not deserve to burn for the sins of their leaders." Park turned away from the window and faced her crew assembled on the observation deck. "Open a channel to the Valkyrie government," she ordered, "and broadcast it to every frequency in their system. Supreme Arbiter." Velthros appeared on the main display, and he looked nothing like the proud ruler who had dismissed human concerns just 9 months ago. His scales were dull and gray, and his 6 eyes showed the hollow exhaustion of a being who had watched everything he built crumble to dust. "Admiral Park," he said, and his voice cracked with defeat, "I am prepared to hear your terms. Where is General Dexolan?" The question surprised Velthros, and he gestured to someone off-screen. Dexolan stepped into view and stood beside the Arbiter, who had ignored his warnings and stripped his command and dismissed his expertise. "General," Park said, "you told me that your people could not imagine anything more dangerous than themselves, and that their arrogance would be their downfall. I did. You were right, and now I'm going to show you and everyone watching that humanity is different." She reached into her uniform jacket and produced a document that had been drafted during her long journey to this moment. "These are our terms," she announced, and her voice carried to every vessel and every surface station and every household with access to a communication screen. Full disarmament of the Valkyrie military, with only defensive forces permitted for 100 years. Velthros closed his eyes in pain but nodded. "War reparations to be paid to every species you conquered, with specific focus on rebuilding worlds you destroyed." Another nod. "Immediate release of all enslaved populations, and full independence for every species you subjugated." Velthros hesitated, and his hands trembled as he accepted the dissolution of everything his ancestors had built. "And finally," Park continued, "war crimes trials for those responsible for atrocities, including the murder of 300 human civilians. You will have your trials." Velthros whispered. The observation deck was silent as the galaxy waited to hear what came next. Every species watching expected Park to announce the orbital bombardment and the systematic destruction, and the genocide that galactic history suggested was the inevitable conclusion of such total victory. Instead, she said something that no one had predicted. "Those are our terms, and if you accept them, then the war is over, and your world will not burn, and your people will live." Dexolan stepped forward, and his scales shifted through colors so rapidly that Park's translator could not keep up with the emotional significance. "You are offering us mercy," he said, and disbelief filled his voice. "I am offering you justice," Park corrected. "There is a difference. After everything we did to you, And after we murdered your people and imprisoned your diplomat and ignored every attempt at peaceful resolution, and you were letting us survive. Yes. Why? Park looked at Minister Cho, who smiled despite the weight of his recent suffering. Because we are not fighting to become what you were, Park said, and her words echoed across 100 worlds. We are fighting to show what you should have been. She straightened and addressed the entire Valkyrie population directly. You believe humanity was weak because we are small and soft and fragile, and you thought our lack of natural weapons meant we could be dismissed and ignored and crushed like all the others. Her voice hardened. Now you know the truth, and now you understand that our strength was never in our bodies, but in our refusal to accept defeat, and in our willingness to sacrifice everything for those we love, and in our ability to rage against the universe itself when justice demands it. She paused and let the words sink in. But strength alone is not what makes a species worthy of respect, and the true measure of civilization is not how you treat those weaker than yourself, but how you treat those you have defeated. Dexolin watched this human woman who could have ordered the extinction of his people and chose mercy instead, and he finally understood what he had glimpsed in all those years of studying human history. Humanity was not just capable of violence. They were capable of choosing when to stop. 1 year later, a monument stood on the exact coordinates where a Valkyrie patrol ship had destroyed a human cargo vessel and ended 300 innocent lives. The names of every victim were carved into black stone that would endure for millennia and below them a simple inscription had been engraved in every language known to the galactic community. They thought we were weak, and they were wrong. Representatives from 40 species attended the dedication ceremony and stood in silence as human families laid flowers at the base of the memorial. General Dexolin represented the new Valkyrie government that he had helped build from the ashes of empire, and he walked forward with a ceremonial wreath clutched in his forearms. He knelt before the monument and placed the wreath among the flowers and bowed his head in genuine grief for the lives his people had taken. When he rose, Admiral Park stood beside him. You warned them, she said quietly, and they did not listen. No, Dexolin agreed. They did not. Will the next generation listen? Dexolin looked at the young Valkyrie delegates who had accompanied him and saw them studying the monument with expressions of shame and sorrow and determination. I will make certain they understand, he said, and I will spend whatever time I have left teaching them the lesson that my generation refused to learn. What lesson is that? Dexolin turned to face the human admiral, and his scale shifted to the deep gold of absolute conviction. That the universe is vast, and there is always something more dangerous than yourself, he said, and that wisdom means learning from those who see what you cannot. Park nodded and returned her gaze to the monument. Then perhaps something good came from all this suffering after all. They stood together in silence as the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the vast darkness between worlds, a new order was being born. One that would remember what happened when an empire disregarded humanity, and one that would never make the same mistake again. 6 months of war had transformed the mighty Valkyrie Empire into a shadow of its former glory, and worlds that had stood unconquered for millennia now flew human flags or burned in the aftermath of battles that defied all rational military analysis. Admiral Unipark commanded the largest human fleet ever assembled from the bridge of her flagship and watched the strategic display show Valkyrie territory shrinking with each passing week. The Empire had controlled over 200 star systems. At the war's beginning, they now held 43 admiral resistance cells on Varathi Prime, report successful sabotage of the planetary defense grid. Her communications officer announced. They are requesting coordination for the liberation assault. Park nodded and marked the system for the next wave of attacks. The resistance cells were not human. They were Korathi and Dasani and Vorn, and a dozen other species that the Valkyrie had conquered and subjugated over centuries of expansion. When humanity began winning, these enslaved populations saw an opportunity they had never dared to imagine. Uprisings spread across occupied worlds as species that had been broken for generations suddenly remembered what hope felt like. General Dexolan watched the collapse. From his position in the War Ministry, where he had been reinstated out of desperate necessity after every other strategic advisor failed to predict human actions, he sat across from Supreme Arbiter Velthros in a chamber that felt far larger and emptier than it had 6 months ago. Our recruitment efforts have failed, Velthros said, and his voice had lost all the arrogance that once defined it. Young Valkyrie refused to enlist because they have seen what happens to our soldiers. Can you blame them? Dexolan replied, our casualties exceed 4 million, and we have gained nothing. Then what would you have me do? Dexolan had asked himself that question every night since the war began, and he had finally reached an answer that required him to betray everything he had once believed in. We must end this war, he said, and the only way to end it is to give humanity what they want. They want our destruction. No, Dexolan corrected. They want justice, and there is a difference, and if we can offer them justice, then perhaps we can salvage something from this catastrophe. He did not mention that he had already begun reaching out through back channels to human intelligence services, and that he had been providing fleet positions and defensive codes and strategic assessments to the enemy. He told himself it was not betrayal, but salvation. The Valkyrie people would survive only if this war ended quickly, and every day it continued meant more death and more destruction and more fuel for human rage. His contacts had arranged something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. A meeting with Admiral Park herself. The neutral station hung in empty space far from any claimed territory and human, and Valkyrie vessels maintained careful distance from each other as 2 shuttles docked at opposite airlocks. Dexolan walked through sterile corridors with no guards and no weapons and nothing but the weight of his people's future pressing down upon him. Admiral Park waited in a sparse conference room, and she looked exactly as exhausted as he felt, with dark circles under her eyes and gray in her hair that had not been there 6 months ago. General Dexolan, she said, and her voice was neutral and cold. You have been very helpful to us. I have been trying to end this war, he replied, and took the seat across from her. Nothing more. Why should I trust anything you say? You should not trust me, Dexolan admitted, but you should trust the intelligence I have provided, because it has been accurate, and it has saved human lives, and that is all the proof I can offer. Park studied him for a long moment, and her dark eyes seemed to look straight through his scales and into whatever passed for a Valkyrie soul. Your people killed 300 of our civilians, she said finally. Children and families on their way to build new lives, and your commander murdered them without a second thought. I know. And your government refused to apologize, and refused to offer reparations, and imprisoned the diplomat we sent to seek peaceful resolution. I know. Then tell me why I should not simply continue this war until your species is a memory. Dexolan leaned forward and let his scales shift to the deep purple of absolute sincerity. Because you are. Not us, he said. Because humanity has proven it can destroy empires, but you have also proven throughout your history that you can show mercy, and that you can rebuild what was broken, and that you can be better than your enemies. Park said nothing. I watched your history. Dexolan continued. I studied your wars and your atrocities and your moments of cruelty that rival anything the Valkyrie have done. And yet, I also saw something else. What did you see? I saw that you sometimes choose to forgive, and I saw that you sometimes extend hands to fallen enemies and help them stand again. And I saw that the same species capable of unimaginable violence is also capable of unimaginable compassion. He reached into his robes and placed a data crystal on the table. This contains everything, he said. Fleet positions and defense codes and political intelligence and the location of Minister Cho and everything you need to end this war in weeks instead of months. Park looked at the crystal but did not touch it. Why are you doing this? She asked. You were a general of the Empire and you swore oaths to defend your people, and yet you betray them to save them. Dexolan considered the question and searched for words that could explain the impossible choice he had made when your ambassadors left. He said quietly, I asked myself one question, and the answer changed everything I believed. What question? I asked why they ignored my warning. Dexolan said, why the Supreme Arbiter and the Council and the Admirals all refused to listen. When I told them exactly what would happen, he paused and let the memory of that moment wash over him. The answer is simple. He continued, they could not imagine anything in the universe more dangerous than themselves, and that arrogance blinded them to reality. And now my people are paying the price for their pride. Park reached across the table and took the data crystal. I will review this intelligence, she said, and if it proves accurate, then perhaps we can discuss terms that do not require the extinction of your species. That is all I can ask. Park stood and walked toward the door, but stopped before leaving. General, she said without turning around. For what it is worth, you were right, and they should have listened. She left without another word. Dexolan sat alone in the empty conference room and allowed himself to hope for the first time in 6 months that something might survive the storm he had seen coming. The attack came without warning and without mercy and without any of the formal declarations that galactic law required. 17 human fleets emerged from faster-than-light travel at 17 different points along the Valkyrie border simultaneously. And the coordination was so precise that Valkyrie commanders initially believed their sensors were malfunctioning. Admiral Una Park stood on the bridge of the battlecruiser, indomitable, and watched the tactical display light up with enemy contacts. As her fleet materialized in the heart of the Valkyrie 3rd Defense Zone, all ships report ready, a tactical officer announced. Enemy fleet is scrambling to intercept. They expected diplomacy, Park said, and her voice carried across the silent bridge. They expected negotiations and threats and posturing because that is how they wage war. She turned to face her crew and saw determination in every face. Show them how humanity wages war. The first Valkyrie ships to engage. The human fleet were veterans of a dozen conquests, and their commanders had never known defeat, and they approached with the casual arrogance of predators who had never encountered anything they could not kill. That arrogance lasted approximately 4 minutes. Human destroyers did not form defensive formations as expected, but instead accelerated directly toward the Valkyrie line with their weapons firing continuously and their shields absorbing punishment that should have forced any sane commander to retreat. Captain Ji-Hoon Roo commanded the destroyer squadron designated Reaper Wing and his 5 ships faced 23 Valkyrie cruisers that outmassed them by a factor of 8. Captain, we are taking heavy damage to forward shields. His weapons officer reported with tension, cracking his voice. Maintain course and increase speed. Roo ordered, Sir, that will put us directly in their primary firing arc. I know. The Valkyrie cruiser commanders could not understand what they were seeing as the tiny human vessels accelerated towards certain destruction, and their tactical computers calculated 0% survival probability for the enemy formation. Then Reaper Wing executed a maneuver that no Valkyrie commander would ever consider. The 5 destroyers dove directly into the upper atmosphere of a nearby gas giant and vanished into the swirling storms of hydrogen and helium. They are fleeing. The Valkyrie fleet commander announced with satisfaction, pursue them into the atmosphere and finish them. His subordinates hesitated because entering a gas giant's atmosphere was extremely dangerous, and the pressure and turbulence would damage their ships. But orders were orders. 12 Valkyrie cruisers followed the human vessels into the storm deep within the churning clouds. Captain Rue watched his sensors carefully and tracked the enemy ships, struggling against winds that exceeded 2,000 kilometers per hour. Human ships were smaller and more maneuverable, and their pilots had trained for exactly this scenario. "They are spreading out to search for us," his sensor officer reported. "Their formation is broken. All ships target their supply vessels orbiting above." Rue commanded, "We are not here to fight their cruisers." Reaper Wing burst from the gas giant's atmosphere behind the Valkyrie. Formation and open fire on the undefended support ships that carried fuel and ammunition for the enemy fleet. By the time the Valkyrie cruisers clawed their way out of the atmosphere with damaged hulls and depleted shields, their supply line had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris across every front. Similar scenes played out as human tactics confounded Valkyrie expectations. When human ships took damage that should have disabled them, they continued fighting. When human pilots found themselves in crippled vessels with no hope of survival, they aimed for enemy carriers and accelerated. When human ground forces were surrounded and offered terms of surrender, they responded with grenades. A Valkyrie admiral named Desrix commanded the defense of the Coven system, and he watched in growing horror as his superior fleet was systematically dismantled by an enemy that refused to behave rationally. "Signal the human flagship," he ordered after his third carrier exploded. "Offer terms of honorable surrender according to the Galactic conventions." His communications officer sent the signal and received a response almost immediately. The message contained only 2 sentences. "Humanity does not accept your surrender, and you may flee or die." Desrix stared at the words and felt something he had not experienced in 2 centuries of military service: fear. "They cannot mean that." His second officer stammered. "The conventions require acceptance of legitimate surrender. Humans did not sign the conventions." Desrix realized with dawning terror. They never agreed to any of it. He ordered his remaining ships to scatter and flee, and watched as human vessels pursued each one with relentless efficiency on the Valkyrie homeworld. General Dex Olin sat in the War Ministry Observation Center and watched the battle reports stream in from every sector. His scales had gone completely white, and his 4 hands trembled as the casualty numbers climbed higher with each passing. Our Supreme Arbiter Velthros stormed into the chamber with his ceremonial robes disheveled and panic. Cracking his usually composed voice, "What is happening?" he demanded. "Our fleets are being slaughtered. I warned you," Dex Olin said without looking up from the displays. "I told you exactly what would happen, and you refused to listen. Then tell me how to stop them." Dex Olin finally turned to face the leader who had dismissed his concerns and mocked his research and stripped him of his command. "You cannot stop them," he said simply. "You do not understand what you are fighting. They are just creatures." Velthro shouted, "Small and soft and fragile, and they should break like all the others. They do not fight for territory or resources or glory," Dex Olin explained, and his voice was hollow with resignation. "They fight for their dead, and they fight for vengeance, and they will not stop until they have extracted a price that satisfies their grief." "What price?" "I do not know," Dex Olin admitted, "but I fear it will be higher than the Empire can pay." A new report flashed across the displays and showed the first Valkyrie world falling to human ground forces after only 6 days of fighting. The defending garrison had outnumbered the human attackers 3-1, and they had fortifications and air support and every advantage that military doctrine said should guarantee victory. None of it mattered. Velthros watched the footage of human soldiers advancing through destroyed streets and fighting through buildings and refusing to retreat, even when wounds should have made movement impossible. "What are they?" he whispered. Dex Olin stood and faced the Supreme Arbiter with absolute certainty in his eyes. "They are humanity," he said, "and you should have listened when I told you to fear them." 3 months of silence stretched across the void between human space and the Valkyrie Empire, and in That silence, the galaxy held its breath and waited for something that most species could not even imagine. Admiral Una Park stood on the observation deck of the United Earth Defense Command Station and watched cargo vessels stream toward the inner colonies with loads of raw materials that would soon become weapons of war. Her reflection stared back at her from the reinforced glass, and she saw a woman who had aged 10 years in 90 days with gray streaking through her black hair and new lines carved around her eyes from sleepless nights. Behind her, the command center hummed with activity that never ceased, and officers coordinated the largest military buildup in human history, and every shipyard from Earth to the frontier colonies worked triple shifts around the clock. Admiral, the final production reports from the Titan yards. Her aide said and handed her a tablet displaying numbers that would have seemed impossible just 4 months ago. 17 new battle cruisers, 42 destroyers, 108 fighter squadrons, and that was just one shipyard among dozens. The reserve activation is complete. The aide continued, every veteran who could hold a rifle has reported for duty, and we have more volunteers than we can process. Park nodded slowly and set the tablet aside. And the Prometheus contingencies? She asked with her voice barely above a whisper. All 12 variants are ready for deployment on your command. Across the galaxy, the Valkyries celebrated their conquest of the Karathi Confederacy with festivals and parades and declarations of eternal glory for the Empire's Supreme Arbiter Velthorus addressed his people from the steps of the Grand Palace and proclaimed that the human question had been resolved without firing a single shot. They saw our strength. He bellowed to cheering crowds. They witnessed the might of the Valkyrie war machine, and they cowered in their little worlds, and they will trouble us no more. General Lex Olin watched the broadcast from his small apartment in the military district where he had been reassigned after his warnings were ignored and his scales remained the pale color of dread that had not faded since the human ambassadors departed. He requested an audience with the Supreme Arbiter 17 times. Each request was denied. He submitted formal reports detailing human military capabilities and psychological profiles and historical patterns of behavior. Each report was filed and forgotten in desperation. He reached out to Admiral Korath and begged the fleet commander to at least increase border patrols and defensive preparations. Korath laughed in his face and told him to enjoy his retirement. Meanwhile, a single human diplomatic vessel crossed into Valkyrie space and requested permission to approach the border station. Minister De Jong Cho sat in the pilot's seat of the unarmed craft with his hand steady on the controls and his heart heavy with the weight of what he carried. He was 63 years old and had spent his entire career building bridges between species and finding common ground where none seemed to exist, and he had volunteered for this mission, knowing it would likely be his last. The Valkyrie border station granted him docking permission with obvious contempt, and armed guards escorted him to a sterile conference room where Ambassador Theraxis waited with undisguised boredom. You humans are persistent, Theraxis said and gestured for Cho to sit. I assumed your silence meant you had finally accepted reality. I come bearing humanity's final terms, Cho said and placed a data crystal on the table between them. Full reparations for the 300 civilians murdered by your patrol commander, an immediate withdrawal from Karathi space, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing broadcast to all species in the galactic community. Theraxis stared at him for a long moment and then began to laugh. The sound was harsh and grating and filled with genuine amusement at the absurdity of what he had just heard. You come to us alone in an unarmed vessel and you make demands. Theraxis wheezed between fits of laughter. Your species truly is as foolish as we believed. These are not demands, Cho said, and his voice remained calm despite the fear churning in his stomach. They are terms and they represent humanity's final attempt to resolve this matter peacefully, and if they are rejected, there will be no further negotiation. Theraxis composed himself and leaned forward with all 6 of his eyes fixed on the human diplomat. Let me explain something to you. Little creature, he said, and venom dripped from every word. The Valkyrie Empire has conquered 17 species across 3 galactic arms, and we have crushed civilizations that span 1,000 worlds, and we have broken the will of beings who considered themselves gods. He picked up the data crystal and crushed it in his massive fist. Your terms are rejected, and your vessel is impounded, and you are now a prisoner of the Empire. Thraxis declared, perhaps watching one of your leaders rot in a cell will teach your people proper respect. Guards seized Cho and dragged him from the room, and he did not struggle or cry out or beg for mercy. He simply looked back at Thraxis. With something in his eyes that the ambassador could not identify, it might have been pity. 3 days later, word of Minister Cho's imprisonment reached Admiral Park through intelligence channels that the Valkyrie did not know existed. She stood alone in her quarters and held a sealed envelope that had waited in her personal safe for 91 days. The envelope bore the seal of the United Earth Council and contained orders that had been drafted the day after 300 civilians died in the cold void of space. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and read this space. 2 words printed in stark black letters: execute Prometheus Park. Closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of grief for what was about to happen and for the lives that would be lost on both sides and for the galaxy. That would never be the same. Then she opened her eyes and walked to her command console and began issuing orders that would set the universe on fire. Across human space, sealed orders were opened simultaneously, and fleet commanders read their instructions, and officers who had trained for this moment their entire careers finally understood what they had been preparing for in the Titan shipyards. The 17 new battlecruisers powered up their engines for the first time in the frontier colonies. Reserve units boarded transport vessels that would carry them to staging areas in research facilities hidden in asteroid belts and buried beneath frozen moons. Scientists activated weapons that had been theoretical concepts just months ago, and in the homes of billions of humans across hundreds of worlds, people looked up at the stars and knew that something had changed, and that their species had been pushed too far, and that the response would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. General Bexolan felt the change before any official announcement reached him, and his scales shifted through every color of terror as instinct screamed what his rational mind had known for months. The silence was over. The storm was coming, and the Valkyrie Empire had no idea when it had awakened. General Bexolan stood before the Grand War Chamber with his forearms clasped behind his back and his scales shifting from deep blue to anxious purple as he faced the most powerful beings in the Valkyrie Empire. The chamber stretched endlessly upward with crystalline pillars that hummed with ancient energy and holographic displays showing the 17 conquered species that now served under Valkyrie rule. Supreme Arbiter Velthros sat upon his elevated throne with his massive form draped in ceremonial armor that had not seen battle in 3 centuries, and his 6 eyes regarded Bexolan with barely concealed amusement. You requested this audience to discuss the humans, Velthros said, and his voice echoed through the chamber like rolling thunder. A species we have had contact with for nearly 40 years, and one that poses no threat to our dominion. Bexolan straightened his posture and refused to show the fear that crawled through his chest. Supreme Arbiter, I have spent 20 years studying humanity since their first contact with our scout vessels, he said, and his voice remained steady despite the weight of 1,000 aristocratic gazes upon him. I have analyzed their history and their wars and their cultural development, and I stand before you now to deliver a formal warning. Laughter rippled through the assembled council members, and Velthros raised one massive hand to silence them. A warning, the Supreme Arbiter repeated with condescension dripping from every syllable. About creatures who stand barely 2 meters tall and possess no natural weapons, and require artificial environments to survive in space. Their physical limitations are precisely what makes them dangerous. Dexolan pressed forward and activated his personal display unit. They evolved on a world classified as a Category 7 death planet with extreme temperature variations and predators on every continent and natural disasters that would have driven any sensible species to extinction. The holographic display showed Earth in all its chaotic beauty, with hurricanes swirling across blue oceans and volcanic eruptions painting skies, orange and massive predators stalking through dense jungles. They did not merely survive this world, Dexolan continued. They conquered it, and they did so not through biological adaptation, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Admiral Korath, commander of the Imperial 7th Fleet, leaned forward with his scarred face twisted in contempt. Every species believes itself special, Korath growled. The Dasani thought their psychic abilities made them invincible until we shattered their minds with neural disruptors, and the Vorm believed their hive coordination was unstoppable until we simply killed their queens. Humans have no such weakness, Dexolan countered, and he pulled up records of human conflicts. They have no central command structure that can be eliminated, and no biological dependency that can be exploited, and no cultural taboo against sacrificing themselves for victory. The display shifted to show human battles throughout their history, and soldiers charging into certain death, and cities burning while defenders refused to retreat, and populations enduring years of siege rather than surrender. During what they call the Second World War, a single human city named Stalingrad held against a superior force for 5 months, Dexolan said, and his voice grew urgent. The defenders fought from rubble, and from sewers, and from the corpses of their fallen comrades, and they lost over 1 million lives, but they did not yield. Impressive for primitives fighting with chemical propellant weapons, another council member scoffed. But irrelevant against our plasma lances and quantum shields. Dexolan felt desperation rising in his chest as he realized his words were falling on deaf ears. You misunderstand, he said, and he stepped closer to the throne despite protocol. Technology is not the issue, and never has been, and humans will find ways to match whatever advantages we possess, because that is what they do. He pulled up one final record, and the chamber fell silent, as they watched footage from a human mining colony that had been raided by the Sani slavers 30 years ago. The colonists had numbered only 200 against the 1,000 Dasani warriors, and they had possessed nothing but mining equipment and improvised explosives. The battle had lasted 3 days when Valkyrie patrol ships arrived to investigate the distress signal. They found every single Dasani dead, and only 47 humans remaining. And those survivors were already fortifying their positions in case more enemies arrived. They did not call for help and wait to be rescued, Dexolan said quietly. They assumed help would never come, and they fought anyway, and they won. Supreme Arbiter. Velthers rose from his throne, and his immense form cast shadows across the entire chamber. General Dexolan, your dedication to your research is noted, he said with finality ringing in his words. But the Empire has decided to annex the Karathi Confederacy and their territory borders, human space, and we will not allow fear of these small, soft creatures to dictate our expansion. Supreme Arbiter, I implore you to reconsider, Dexolan said, and he dropped to one knee in supplication. If we provoke humanity, and if we harm their people, and if we give them cause to view us as enemies, we will unleash something we cannot control. The annexation will proceed, Velthers declared. You are dismissed. Dexolan rose slowly and looked around the chamber at faces filled with arrogance and contempt, and not single trace of understanding. When the time comes, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the vast room, Remember that I warned you, and remember that you chose not to listen." He turned and walked from the chamber with his scales shifting to the deep black of morning. 3 weeks later, the annexation of the Karathi Confederacy began with overwhelming force, and the Valkyrie fleet swept through system after system with barely any resistance human. Diplomatic vessels arrived at the border with formal protests and demands for negotiation and requests for the Empire to respect established territorial boundaries. The Supreme Arbiter had their messages deleted without reading them. On the 42nd day of the annexation, a Valkyrie patrol squadron encountered a human cargo vessel in disputed space near the Karathi border. The vessel was unarmed and carried 300 civilian colonists traveling to a new settlement world. Commander Vassis of the patrol squadron had been drinking fermented nectar to celebrate another successful day of conquest, and his judgment was clouded and his patience was thin when the human vessel refused to alter course and insisted on its right to free passage through neutral space. Vexus ordered his weapons officer to fire a warning shot. The shot was not aimed carefully. The human vessel broke apart in a bloom of fire and atmosphere, and 300 lives ended in an instant. Vexus reported the incident as destruction of a hostile vessel that refused lawful commands, and the Imperial Navy awarded him a commendation. For vigilance, no apology was issued. No reparations were offered. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing was made within 1 hour of the news reaching human space. Every human ambassador in Valkyrie territory went silent and packed their belongings and boarded their vessels and departed without a word. General Dexolan watched the departure from his window in the capital city, and his scales had shifted to the pale white of absolute terror. He knew what the silence meant. He had studied human history, and he had seen this pattern before, and he knew that when humans went quiet, when they stopped talking and stopped negotiating and stopped demanding justice through words, it meant they had chosen a different path. The galaxy had just made an enemy it did not understand. And Dexolan knew with horrible certainty that by the time the Empire realized its mistake, it would be far too late to undo the damage. The humans were not afraid. They were preparing.